1991's Zombie Cop is the second entry in the J.R Bookwalter SOV 6-pack, and to me, having covered 3 of Bookwalter's films up to this point, I would say this is probably his second best work that I've covered to date. What keeps it off the top spot? Well, this film has a couple of problems. But we'll get to exactly what those problems are in good time. This review should be fairly short and sweet in all honesty. For the most part, I really liked this one. That, and it only really clocks in at around about 60 minutes long, and a large chunk of that time is eaten up with action scenes and car chases. Add into that how simplistic the script is, and yeah, there isn't really a ton to dissect here. But let's get the plot out of the way before we look under the hood, eh? So, the plot is, well, it exists. I think that's about the nicest thing I can say about it. It follows Gil, our hero of the picture, who's buddied up with his bestie for a night of fighting crime and taking names. They get a dispatch to a disturbance taking place in a nearby apartment complex, and it transpires that they've actually landed on something quite a bit more involved than just a domestic or neighbourly spat. It transpires that they've accidentally stumbled on the Doctor of Death, a known and ridiculously wanted drug trafficker and murderer with at least 67 murders under his belt. The pair think they've hit the jackpot, as bringing in someone like Death could give them a serious promotion, or at least some kind of extra vacation time. So the pair plan a sting operation. However, all isn't quite as it seems. The Doctor is an expert in voodoo and witchcraft, and he's actually in the middle of brewing a potion with devastating consequences. When Gil enters the apartment attempting to perform a surprise sting on Death, he finds that Death has planned this entire event, and that the domestic was literally just Death and a mannequin throwing each other about in front of closed curtains. It's here that Death drinks his potion and throws some over Gil. The fracas triggers Gil's buddy, who opens fire on the apartment complex, and Death gets hit. But with his last act, he guns down and murders Gil. All seems super depressing for a brief period, and we flash forward to a few days later where Gil's buddy friend Stevens has just left Gil's funeral. But that night, there's disruption in the graveyard, as both Gil and the Doctor of Death are reborn. They burst out of the ground, and by sheer coincidence, they're quite near to each other and both came out of the ground at around about the same time. I can only imagine how awkward it would have been if they'd have been buried in different cemeteries. Anyway, the Doctor of Death announces that the potion he and Gil consumed basically causes immortality. Both of them are now dead and completely unable to actually properly die. They can be shot, cut up, burned, or stuck on a pike cannibal holocaust style, and they'll just live. Death basically describes it as something along the lines of they'll live till the flesh rots off their bones and their bones turn to dust. And even at the dust stage, he isn't entirely sure if they'll truly even be dead then. So basically, Gil's now just gonna rot to death. And the biggest stinger? If he tries to kill Death, he'll die himself. Death then escapes, and the only person Gil can really turn to is Stevens. Stevens, meanwhile, gets a call from the station that there's been grave robbers at the graveyard, and as he's getting up and getting ready to go do some seriously grim crime prevention, who's standing on his doorstep? But Gil. Stevens refuses to believe that Gil's unalive, thinking that stress and other things are just making him see things. But Gil eventually makes his case and convinces Stevens that they've got to find Death to see if they can break the curse. And if they can't, that they bring Death to justice and lock him away for good. Stevens gives Gil one of his old police uniforms, and with the help of some bandages and a little fine stitching, Zombie Cop is born. And the rest of the film is pretty much just a series of action-paced scenes as Zombie Cop and Stevens try to track down the Doctor of Death, who's now being assisted by one of his ex-henchmen, so I guess he's still kind of a henchman? I don't know. Either way, from here on in, it's an action-packed ride of car chases, shootouts, and a chase through a playground as Death tries to get away with his ultimate scheme of mass decimation, and Zombie Cop and Stevens stay hot on the trail. So, The plot at a high level is great. It's fast-paced, it's got tons of action, and it's as simple a plotline you can really envision, basically cops and robbers, but with a nice twist to keep it fresh and somewhat original. This is one of those movies you can kind of turn your brain off for the duration. From a script perspective, all of JR's films have aped and referenced previous genres of movies, and while you'd think Zombie Cop was going to ape the horror genre, it actually goes for the action buddy cop genre, and it does so in a much, much more subtle way than previous attempts. I mainly picked up generic tropes from buddy cop movies, and the only one thing I distinctly picked up a reference to were several moments from RoboCop, and maybe at a push some minor elements of Highlander. But these are massively played down here, and whereas with his previous films like The Dead Next Door or Kingdom of the Vampires, where these films literally just name-dropped other horror movies to the point that entire scenes were more or less transplanted into them, here we get a couple of lines that sound a bit RoboCop-y, a couple of scenes that feel like scenes from RoboCop, and I believe the final line of the film is a parody of the final line from RoboCop. Everything else is pretty much either a generic idea from buddy cop and action movies, or an original idea. And I really, really liked the script for this one for being a bit less heavy on the references. As an aside as well, this movie has a small cameo come Easter egg towards the end of it featuring J.R Bookwalter. I won't spoil it here, but it was tonally perfect for this movie and really made me laugh when it happened, so big thumbs up from me. The pacing is good and solid. For 60 minutes-ish, it just rockets by and really doesn't overstay its welcome. I think the 3-act structure kind of goes a bit to the wall, which is a shame. There really doesn't feel like there's much in the way of a consistent second act. Like, the first act takes us from the opening to Zombie Cop becoming Zombie Cop, and the third act is pretty much just one long chase fight sequence. But the second act, it's more structured around finding death and doing police work, and I don't know, it just kind of feels like it doesn't leave that big of a mark in establishing the gear change that a second act is happening now. I do, however, think that the runtime for this one is absolutely perfect. It left me wanting just a little bit more, but equally was a satisfying watch, and to me, that's the perfect balance. If it had been longer, I might have been satisfied and just thought it was okay. Any shorter and I'd have felt like I was missing something. But here, it wet my whistle and I'd love to see more. Tonally as well, I think, for the most part, it's great. It's upbeat, punchy, the dialogue's mostly good and solid. I think the way they've approached this script is very much in Bookwalter's wheelhouse, and it just sits on the right side of slightly over-the-top dialogue. It was something I really got on with. Now, you might be asking, well, Dan, if you like the script so much, why don't you marry it? And you know what? I would. If it wasn't for the big reason this film is my second favourite to Robot Ninja. And that's because this film has a big old fuck-off bucket of racism in it. So before we go any further, let's address that one, shall we? So, the primary, though certainly not worst example in this, would be the Doctor of Death himself, who's clearly playing on stereotypes around Jamaican and Haitian heritage of voodoo and witchcraft. It's incredibly poor taste. They didn't have to do it, and they don't really even have the argument of, well, it was a different time, because this was 1991, and I can assure viewers that it was as disrespectful then as it is now. Initially, when putting my thoughts together for this film, I was going to compare it to the voodoo and witchcraft stuff that's seen in other movies like Live and Let Die, as a way of maybe kind of sort of saying, well, it's bad but it could have been worse. But really that's bollocks too, quite honestly, because it was wrong in Live and Let Die as well, and Live and Let Die was made in 1973 for Christ's sake. They literally shouldn't have done this, and they did. But that's not the most egregious thing in this film. No, the most egregious thing in this film is one of the store clerks who appears 2 or 3 times. And I'm going to be honest and upfront here, I am not sure what the PC term to describe this is. I've seen various people use the terms brown face, Asian face, yellowed up. I honestly don't know, and I'm going to be honest, Google wasn't helpful either, so apologies if any or all of those terms were offensive, but basically they've darkened a white man's skin, wrapped a towel around his head, and made him talk in a stereotypical Indian accent. Now, I don't need to tell you how awful that is, and if I do, even if your argument is it's just a movie, even if Trauma or Full Moon have done worse in the last 30 years than this, you need to do some soul searching, because what's captured in this film, even for just a few moments, it's abhorrent, it's awful, nasty stereotyping, and just utterly blatant racism. Now, unfortunately, the only comments I can find from Bookwalter and Jason Walsh about this film come from an unverified piece of trivia on IMDb and a more general statement in the making of doc on the Blu-ray release for this, which basically says that they disown the film and that it's a bad home video that should never have been released. Which, I mean, while being dismissive of the whole thing is basically being dismissive of the racism within it, it doesn't help to clarify the situation. I really don't know from which side this came from, as this was co-written between Bookwalter and Matthew Jason Walsh, but they both agreed on it. They both, at the time, thought there was nothing wrong in portraying people and cultures like that, and while I'm glad that they've disowned the film in its entirety, which I personally think is a bit much, yes, the racism is unforgivable, but the rest of the film outside of that awfulness is actually quite good fun, I found, this really tainted my experience with the film. Which is a real shame, because the direction in this film is some of the best I've seen Bookwalter produce, and that's out of all of his films. It may not look the prettiest thanks to the limitations of VHS, but this feels like a movie, for the most part. With well-organised sequences, some really nice filmic shots and location work throughout, and this thing has a bloody car chase in it that features characters jumping from car to car and having a shootout while driving. And it's done insanely well. I feel very much like Kingdom of the Vampires must have been a steep learning curve for Bookwalter in terms of how to present and shoot on VHS, because this film more or less irons out all the problems I had with the direction in his previous effort. Interior shots have wonderfully moody lighting and that trademark use of colour gels that really lets some of these scenes pop. Equally, it looks like he's also more or less ironed out the kinks of shooting outdoors as well, with some snappy, nicely toned sequences that do make use of their locations to great effect. And while it maybe goes a little bit silly towards the end, as there's a fight chase scene in a children's playground that sent me distinctive Trauma vibes, it's got clean creative direction. It feels like a professional production. And barring one or two wobbly bits here and there, for example the choice to reuse some stock shots from Kingdom that I personally feel were a little too overly dark or grainy, I really got on with this. It feels like Bookwalter has managed to transplant the work he built on with The Dead Next Door and Robot Ninja into the SOV world, and with it he's really dragged the standards up with this one. The Cine 2 also has a big boost. I think one of the biggest flaws with Bookwalter's previous SOV efforts was that he shot a lot of things at night using whatever lighting he could do to support that. Here, the majority of the film is either shot indoors or out in daylight, and as a result it offers much more control over how those shots look and feel, and offers greater scope to get experimental with lighting setups. As such, some of the sequences in this film look really nice, and once again, we're treated to a really decent selection of shot types within those sequences, which definitely helped to win me over. They've also gotten much better with masking hard to pull off shots, like, for example, some of the scenes of people jumping between cars in the chase sequence, which is a definite highlight for me. They really cover these things from all angles, and with some super tight and responsive editing, it's a really decent attempt at making something that looks a lot grander than it probably was. And when you consider that the budget for this film was, again, only $2,500, all in, it's all the more impressive that he was able to turn around a film that looks this good. As I've gone through Bookwalter's filmography, I've grown to realise that the man really specialises in a particular type of ham. He can really do somewhat manic action ham really well on a performance level. I don't think he can write romance or sadness particularly well, but if he's writing for a character with a gun and nothing to lose, by God you're gonna have a fun time. And the casting choices here are pretty perfect for the job, in fairness. Michael Kemper as Gil is about as good as a leading man I've ever seen in an SOV flick. He's got just the right ratio of cool, suave leading man material to just outright ham, and in doing so he creates a wonderfully entertaining balance. His performance is something I'm more than happy to sit through for the full runtime. Equally, while problematic, James Black gives it his all as the Doctor of Death. He's OTT, campy, and the perfect villain to counter Zombie Cop's cooler-than-thou-ness. And I'm glad to see that he's actually gone on to have quite a successful career too. The supporting cast pretty much do their best, but honestly, there isn't really much to talk about with them. In part because, well, they're all trying, but also because this is a super small cast for this kind of a production. There are only 21 people in this movie, and that covers extras and a cameo from the director. But I suppose at least it somewhat reduces the risk of a bad performance. So to that end, I'd say for the most part, everyone here is playing just about fine. Finally, the soundtrack. And we have another absolute winner here. Seriously, even if the film sucks, Bookwalter's movies always pull through on the score. It's a range of fast-paced, pounding action flick fodder, and the only criticism that I have about it really is that the track list feels a bit shorter in this movie than his others. And as such, I did notice a bit more repetition of tracks in this than usual. I mean, it's hardly a cardinal sin to repeat your music over and over again throughout a movie, but when the film's as short as this is, and when the film is so demanding of the score to make the action scenes really pop, it really does draw attention to moments where they've just played the title theme again. Like I say, this soundtrack's good and solid, I just think it could have maybe done with a couple more tracks to really help flesh it out. Zombie Cop was released on VHS in 1991 by Home Cinema Video. As far as I can tell, it didn't get a DVD release outside of the US, but in the US it's had multiple releases. Of note being a release from Makeflix, both riffed and unriffed as part of their Bad Movie Police series, which I'm led to believe Bookwalter had some involvement with too. IMDb's a bit hazy, but I believe it was in an editing capacity. The film finally got a full Blu-ray release in 2020 courtesy of Makeflix, and the extras for this one, while somewhat comprehensive, are also somewhat thin on the ground. You have two making-ofs that basically cover the same ground but with about a 10-year gap between them, some trailers and a couple of commentary tracks. I'd have really been interested to see how they restored this one, but I guess you can't have everything in life. It's a good, solid release and probably the best one that this movie's going to get. Zombie Cop is an entertaining, if not slightly too manic movie. It jumps from plot point to plot point with almost no regard for the audience's needs or requirements, but it's fun. If you come to this movie expecting a high-grade professional feature, you're going to be disappointed. I've seen people compare this film rather unfairly to Ed Wood levels of incompetency. But even a cursory scratch below the surface will find some pretty solid direction. There's some really decent uses of cine and lighting, some half-decent if not a little exaggerated performances, and a script that, while deeply problematic in places, is, on a surface level, entertaining, and keeps the references and in-jokes relatively subtle. I think this was a fun one, and if you have about an hour to kill, I think you might get a kick out of it.